Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode on Fit as a Fiddle. I have an amazing guest today here for you guys that I'm equally super excited to learn more about because this is our first face to face. Of course, everything is on Zoom and virtual, but face to face with each other. That's outside of emails and other kind of communication. But our guest today is Haylin Belay. She is a sexual health educator and a trauma informed body worker. And I connected with her because my friend Cleo Stiller, who is also on the show, wrote a book called Modern Manhood. And I was reading that book, and Haylin was quoted in the book for, one of the topics. I know, so cool. And so I was obviously, me being me, I was like, I need to know who this girl is and I want to know everything. So I reached out to Haylin, and then lo and behold, months later, here we are on the show together. So welcome to the show, Haylin.
Thank you for having me. And shout out to Cleo, also a friend of mine, also Cleo, who we actually met originally because she did an interview about sex toys with me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, since then it's developed into a beautiful friendship of just talking about all kinds of sexuality topics, which is really all I want to talk about.
I love it so much. So, Haylin, I would love for you to explain to the audience what it means to be. I just said you're a pleasure-based sexual health educator. It's on your bio, and a trauma-informed body worker, but it might be kind of abstract concepts for people to understand what that even means in the terms
Mhm.
of your work. So, I'd love for you to give a broad general introduction on that and what brought you into the space as well.
Yeah. So it's always a fun journey to try and explain to people not just what I do, but how I came to do it because I wear a lot of hats. Sexual health educator and body worker are some of the most legible ones. So they're usually the ones that I put forward first. But even still, because of the world that we live in, some people hear sexual health educator and they still have no frame of reference for like, okay, but what do you actually do? Because I didn't get good sex ed. So, what are sex educators actually doing when they are in schools or when they are in these spaces, these community spaces. So, as a sexual health educator, that's actually where my career began, was in, well, all right, technically, my career began as a youth activist in high school with my high school GSA. I don't know if GSA is still a term that's used in high schools, but
I'd love for you to de-acronym that for me,
yeah,
especially.
Gay Straight Alliance.
Ah, yes, of
Yeah.
course, of course, of course.
So yeah, I'm not sure if that's still. It's like I haven't seen GSAs as much in high schools now. They usually have different names, or at least they did in New York where I was teaching most recently. But the Gay Straight Alliance was something I got involved in high school, and through the Gay Straight Alliance, being in the state of Texas, where not only can you not get good sex ed, but you also can't talk about queer relationships in the classroom. We were trained as young people to teach queer inclusive sex ed to other young people in this kind of like guerrilla peer educator sort of structure. And that was my first introduction to the idea that not only is sexuality something that like wow, there's information here that an adult could have just told me instead of me having to learn by all of these negative experiences and learn by making these mistakes, but also realizing that health and politics were connected, that those things were extremely intimately connected. And that was actually the first place where I heard the term systems of oppression at the age of 16, was at a youth activist training camp, learning from at that time, he seemed so old to me. I was like, wow, you're such a grown up. He was like 24. But I was like, oh, this is amazing and brilliant grown up who's teaching me about systems of oppression. And realizing that it went so much further than even just the what was obvious to me at the time of like I feel like I'm being restricted from information that would really help me, and coming to understand that it wasn't just that I was being restricted from information but also being restricted from bodily experiences, and that's part of what helped me make that transition from being a sexuality educator and working with this kind of straight up sex ed, putting condoms on bananas and teaching young people about how reproduction happens, into thinking more critically about like what is my role as a sex educator. Am I just here to teach people how condoms work and where babies come from? Because that's stuff they can Google if they really don't know. And what I really think of as my role as a sexuality educator is helping young people become sexually responsible adults, or helping adults become sexually responsible adults, right? Helping people access a healthy exploration of pleasure that is authentic to them and that is really embodied. So, as a sexual health educator, reproductive health is important, but that's not even close to being the entire story. I started doing more social emotional skills education because I realized I can talk to somebody about consent all the live long day, but if I'm not teaching them communication skills, I haven't really given them the ability to put what I've taught them
Hmm.
into practice and into action. So I started doing more work around, you know, introspection and self care, understanding your own bodily experiences so that you know whether or not you want to consent to something. Like, that's a huge piece of sexuality education that gets left behind when we focus just on condoms on bananas. And then from sexuality to social emotional skills, and then from social emotional skills into the body work, because the more that I was teaching young people and adults about these like mental psychological topics, the more obvious that it became that I was running into the same issue, right? Of, I'm giving you information, but you can't put it into practice because you're at a place where a vulnerability in your body is intolerable. And so becoming a body worker, becoming a yoga instructor, learning more about somatic experiencing and the way that the body experiences trauma, really that thread goes all the way back to not just wanting to be a good sexuality educator, but wanting to be a good activist, like wanting to make a world that looks more like the world that I'd like to live in. And it's like the further that I peeled back those onion layers, the more clear to me it became that it really is so about the body and the ways that we culturally and individually are taught to cut off the relationship from our body, sexually and non-sexually, and the ways that that all the information in the world isn't going to make a difference. It's not going to move the needle until someone has been able to reconcile with their body experience and like stay in their body long enough to navigate that world in front of them.
Wow, I could just hear you forever. This is why you should have been on the show much earlier too. Oh my God. I resonate with so much of that. I love how you just brought it from like just educate like this, you brought like the school system and to the political realm into like the psychosocial aspects of consent and sexuality into like a very physical manifestation of it all. And it's very true that all of those things are extremely related. I mean, if I just talk about like, and I see that you're so purpose driven, and you're so passionate about this. So you could probably just keep going on. And I know you are just containing yourself right now. I could tell. For anyone who's watching the video, you can tell she's containing herself.
Holding it in.
um, but it's the same. I mean, I'm a public work physical therapist, and it all connects from paid parent leave to needing to work to taking care of your physical health to having dysfunction and back pain and et cetera, to the economics behind all of that. And then between dynamics and different relationships with your partner or family members and how all of that contributes to one's wellness, and health. And I'm fully aware that there's all those elements when it comes to care and treating yourself well. I'm really interested in learning more about the trauma aspect of this for the listeners today and for myself as well, to learn from you a bit more. Um, can you explain a little bit about what you do in that space to help people to understand their trauma, or however you describe it, to work
Mm-hmm.
through it, to and be able to, I guess, integrate it? I don't
Yeah,
know if
integrate's usually
trauma
the word I use.
disappears. I think
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, you tell me, but I don't know if trauma disappears from one's life. I think you
Yeah.
integrate it in a way that's healthy. If I'm not mistaken, that's the way that I understand it in my world. But I'd love for you to talk about it a little bit more in your world too.
Yeah. So I'm very lucky in that because I wear all these different hats, I've been able to take trauma informed trainings in different fields. So there's like there's the trauma informed yoga approach to thinking about how we integrate trauma. There's a trauma informed pedagogy, trauma informed education, and how we think about how bodies integrate trauma. But the commonality that all of those trainings and resources and courses have is that really at the end of the day, what we're talking about is nervous systems. We're talking about how we perceive the world, how we make decisions about the world, where our impulses come from, our reflexes, our voluntary choices. All of that stuff is the nervous system. And when we think about what the nervous system evolved to do, right, its purpose is to keep us alive. And the main way it keeps us alive is by motivating our behavior through sensation and perception. So I love this little like mind game of telling people like you've never perceived reality in your life, right? Like we all live in the matrix. We all have our own personal computer simulation that's running. And there's like the college dorm version of this that's like, what if what I see is green is at what you see is blue? We'd have no way of knowing. But on a deeper, much deeper level, what we're talking about is this translation that happens of the raw material of reality, right? The raw material of existence being translated through our nervous system into a perceptual experience that we can understand and that's going to motivate our behavior. So when I feel pain in my body, it may or may not be pain that is there because of a physiological thing that's happened to my body. And I'm sure as a pelvic floor therapist, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right?
Hmm.
So much of our pain experience is that's a nerve is telling us that something is wrong and it's trying to motivate us, usually to stop moving whatever part of our body is in pain. That may or may not have to do with a literal mechanical issue with the issue with those tissues. And more often than not, right, even when you talk about people who have, say, like habitual or postural musculoskeletal issues, that even those mechanical issues with the tissues actually have this psychosomatic, like emotional origin, right? It starts with stressed out nerves that are hyper reactive to signals of danger because your nervous system, you know, as a part of your body processes, is looking at everything around you and trying to discern what's dangerous, what's safe and inviting, you know, the evolutionary drive of staying alive long enough to procreate, even if that's not a personal goal that you hold as a person. That is the way that our nervous systems are sort of set up. And so when we think about trauma, you know, I remember as a young person really learning about trauma as like, you know, you're a normal person and then something happens to you and then you're a traumatized person, and a traumatized person is like you've cut the line of their life experience, and healing looks like kind of stitching that line back together and trying to be the person that you were before the really bad thing happened. And that is so not only not accurate to like how trauma actually works as a body experience, but is also a really damaging and re-traumatizing thing to tell somebody in the aftermath of trauma, to be like, oh yeah, you're broken now, because of the really dangerous experience that you had and because of the things that your body did to try and keep you alive. That actually makes you broken and you're dysfunctional, and that's a problem, and it's, you know, it's something that needs to be repaired. In reality, all of the trauma responses that we talk about, fight, flight, fawning, freezing, those are all healthy parts of a emotional spectrum of experience. You have those experiences in your body because we evolved to have those experiences so they could save our lives. That freeze response is, you know, when you see a grizzly bear in the woods, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to play dead. And so that physiological response of I'm in some kind of extreme danger and my body is calculating, you know, what are my options? My options are, you know, in some situations, maybe I have a chance at escaping the situation, or in some situations, maybe the best thing that I can do is be immobilized. Like the social and kind of human judgments that we put on those behaviors make it so much more difficult for people to move on with their lives and perceive themselves as not broken people, but people who have accessed a broader spectrum of their emotional possibility, right? And being able to integrate that trauma really looks like being able to uh, essentially reassure your nervous system that you're not still in the danger that you perceived yourself to be whenever the really dangerous thing happened or whenever you were in the really dangerous environment. And a lot of times that doesn't, it's not just about helping people experience pleasure. It's really about helping people feel comfortable enough with the possibility of experiencing fear that they can stay in their bodies long enough to feel pleasure. Because if you
Wait, wait,
can't
wait.
be
Say that again. Say that one more time.
okay,
That was like a lot of brain overload on
yes.
processing that
So
last line one more time.
so this idea of like I'm had trauma and I'm struggling to access pleasure, right? We want to feel good. But if you feel so scared of feeling bad that you leave your body at the first sign of anything even remotely dangerous, you're not going to get to the place where you can experience pleasure, because those run on the same nervous system pathways. Right? It's like the same parts of your body that are involved in detecting things that are dangerous and detecting things that are safe. And if you're really hyper reactive, right, your nervous system is constantly seeing everything, every possible thing around you as catastrophic failure, catastrophic danger, then accessing pleasure actually starts with creating safe environments to re-experience fear and anxiety in a container that is like safe enough to hold it and to let you reacclimate to a broad emotional spectrum, right? A world where you can experience fear and anxiety like you're supposed to when scary things are happening. That's a really useful and functional way to move through the world. And I think it's a real disservice that happens to people who experience trauma, that they're told that like actually what trauma has done to you is made you less able to move through the world, when in reality, like, you know, the things that your body does in response to trauma are like wholehearted efforts to keep you alive. And I think reconciling that relationship of like, I'm not at war with my body. We have the same goal. We just have different methodologies and we need to learn how to speak each other's language and work together. So
I
that's
think
that's what
that's
I
like
do.
that's like the most articulate way I have ever been described with about the whole concept of trauma. I mean, you hear it a lot in pop culture and like different places, but I think that was the most articulate and actually the most real way that I've ever heard it be explained. And that's so true. I love that. I love that explanation. And I think it's really important to shift this language because there's a lot of things that we've done in the past with the way that we've kind of dealt with many things in the world. And especially when it comes to, because trauma can be in a lot of different, it doesn't have to be sexual trauma, right? It can be lots of different types of kinds of trauma, and it can really span across the age spectrum. So you can integrate one aspect of trauma, if we're using the word integrate, or like move through a phase of your life and then experience it differently in a different phase of your life. It's kind of, we can't just say that's an event that's past and it's never going to happen again, maybe not to the same capacity, to the same extent, to the same quality. But I think it's really important to understand that, like you just said, it's that spectrum of understanding yourself and understanding what your bodily responses are. You said it so beautifully. I can't even like repeat it back as well as you just said.
Thank you. Well, it's really something that, like, I think one of the most useful things I ever heard about trauma was in a trauma informed yoga training where my teacher was talking about like their big bold hot take statement was that events are not traumatic. And I was like, what are you talking about? Of course they are. Haven't you seen the list of adverse childhood experiences? Like that's the list of traumatic events. But having that reframe of, you know, it's not that the event itself is some kind of contamination that happened to you that's caused this trauma. It's that your nervous system perceived, usually the way I like to frame it is your nervous system has a perception that you failed at keeping yourself safe, whatever failure means. And that perception of failure means that your nervous system no longer trusts itself, and that's where that hyperreactivity comes from. So that can be something that comes from something like sexual trauma, some of those high impact trauma events, but that can also be something that comes from living decades of life with daily microaggressions and, you know, daily experiences of being dehumanized or minimized or objectified or marginalized. Those kinds of experiences are also trauma. Those there's literally a term for what happens to Black women's nervous systems, weathering, like this weathering that happens to Black women's nervous systems as a result of the physiological impact of essentially being given these danger signals constantly, chronically, and in places that are, you know, in places that are going to really turn up the knob of that hyperreactivity. If you're experiencing, not just experiencing racism, but then also being gaslit and told that you're not, your nervous system is really going to go haywire.
Right. And I think that all these conversations are very, very, very specific to what's happening in our generation right now. That's also not very different from what's happened before. But I think that it's in the last like 5 years and really in the last like 2 years for so many reasons. And I think that social media has helped to increase the visibility. It's not like these things didn't exist before. It's not like racism or sexual abuse or domestic violence or just different things that people maybe do overtly or not overtly to each other. It's always existed. But I think that, I mean, if you we go back to referring to Cleo's book, remember she talked about like, oh, all the way in the back in the day, like the differences between gender, gender equality way back in the day, even with hunter and gatherers, and then the agricultural revolution and what that did to separate women into the household and just make them baby makers. And, so I think that there's always been inequality in so many different ways that's caused and created so many different kinds of trauma to different generations. But I think it's very important that I think because of the visibility for people to actually hear each other's voices in ways that, I mean, whether they're listening or not is a a whole different conversation, but they're hearing each other's voices, I think has made this topic really important. And that's why I wanted to talk to you on the show today, because I love these insights. I think that you're coming from such an educated space that's like, not only is it evidence-based, but it's empathetic and it's just real and it's just normal in my eyes to see it this way. Whether it's normal for other people to see it that way, I don't know. But for me, it just it makes so much sense, everything that you're saying. And I would love for listeners to also learn about how you would be able to kind of teach all of this information and what are the different avenues and different methods that you can disseminate this information and trauma informed care.
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways. Because I come from like a classroom background, I think of it a lot in terms of what are the pedagogical tools that I'm offering, especially in these last few years now that everything is virtual and I'm not going into classrooms and teaching the way that I normally would. So the way that I think about what I offer. I have this manifesto on my website that all people deserve an integrated life and the healthy pursuit of pleasure, and everything that I do has to be in service of that. That's the one like rule that I have for the constraints of my work. And so what that means is that I have a lot of flexibility within that umbrella to make offerings in a lot of different ways. I have like regular practice offerings, like things that are like weekly self body work classes, things that are meant to help people stay consistent in a practice. But really, I think the primary thing that I've been focusing my energy and effort into is making self-paced experiential learning programs and really taking advantage of, all right, stop me because I could go on a whole tangent about this. I just like finished a course about e-learning pedagogies, but the new opportunities for how people can learn in digital spaces, I think is really exciting, especially when we're talking about trauma-informed education. If I'm trying to do psychoeducation for somebody, I'm trying to teach them skills-based things about how to create those safe containers for processing their trauma, right? That's something that is normally I'd want to be there with them. I'd want to be able to be there with them and I'd be able to be those guardrails. But if I can't be those guardrails, right, in person, the sort of trade-off that we get with these digital resources is that I then have a structure where I can teach someone how to put those guardrails up for themselves. So my programming is really built around the idea that I'm not giving people information. Like I said earlier, right? There's a lot of information you can just Google. I'm not here to just give you stuff that you can memorize and then you have this information bouncing around your head and you're not using it. All the work that I do is really focused on being skills based and teaching people the information they need to put a skill into practice, and then giving them practices and ways that they can self-reflect and self-assess. Because honestly, a huge part of what I experience, and I'm sure you've probably had similar experiences working with trauma impacted people, like I do a lot of stuff around spirituality and witchcraft, and I'll get people who've had traumatic experiences with like a religious upbringing, and then they come to me and they're like, "So I want to practice witchcraft, and I have all these books, but I don't want to mess up and the sort of invisible implication is like and go to hell, like there's still this thing that they're holding on to, right, from the framework and the worldview that was taught to them in the traumatic and the unsafe environment that they're carrying with them in the new environment, and coming to me and saying, give me the rules, like give me the external rules that I'm supposed to abide by and live in, and sort of be subjugated to. And I feel like my role as an educator is in helping people to learn how to hone their own instrument in order to make those decisions for themselves. I feel like I've done my job if I've taught somebody how to do something, more so than just giving someone a fun trivia fact that is like, whoa, that blew my mind, and I'm going to share it on Instagram, but I'm still going to go back to exactly the same behaviors that I had before, because the information alone is not sufficient to actually make the change. So like the ways that that happens can be really different. The programs that I have range from like healing the traumatized body to like sex magic for survivors. So there's a really big span of, the really anatomy and bodywork focused stuff versus the more spiritual and kind of like self-care ritualization stuff. All of it is useful and all of it comes from that same foundation. So my goal was really just to offer it in as many variations as I can so that people can find the right sort of channel and avenue and language to start accessing that for themselves, because everyone has that within themselves. You don't need somebody else to do it for you.
Yeah, I think the key word here that you just said is that everyone has the ability to access in what ways that make sense to them. Just even as a physical therapist, if I see two people with the exact same like background, exact same diagnosis, me giving them the exact same information is not enough. You have to frame it. You have to talk about it. Some people need more support. Some people need less support. Some people need lots of hoorahs. Some people need email, text messages, and lots of reminders. Like everyone needs something different to feel supported and be successful. So I think it's really cool that you offer various methods. The same goal, from what I understand, is for everyone to live a happy life, that they feel comfortable in their skin, they feel good with their mental well-being and their physical well-being and their spiritual well-being. And I think it's amazing that you offer this avenue that's I love how evidence-based and how scientific it is. That feeds my PT soul. But as coming from an ancient background with yoga and Hindu philosophies and spirituality is a big, big, big part of my life, I think that I somehow automatically weave it into the work that I do. But having a very separate way where you say, this is a spiritual way to do it, I think it is real. I'm not technically allowed to do that with a doctorate.
Yeah. It's different.
It's a little different, but I love that you have those different ways that people can attain the same wellness. And I love that. Haylin, how do people get in touch with you and contact you and get to know you a little bit more and work with you?
Yeah, so you can find more just stuff, content on my Instagram, haylin.co. Haylin.co is also my website, so I'm pretty easy to find. Haylin.co is pretty much what I am everywhere that I can be haylin.co, or else I'm just haylin.co without the dot. Um, and that's Haylin, Haylin. The best way to actually get in touch with me, though, like actually work with me, is by sending me an email. I'm hi@haylin.co. And if you are interested in any of the things that I just named and you're like, I want to start right now, again, that's the beauty of digital learning. I have a whole bunch of stuff that you can jump into right now while I'm sleeping if I'm not immediately available, but I also do one-on-one work.
That's awesome. And I'll drop all of that information on the show notes for listeners today as well. Haylin, is there anything else you'd like to add for anyone today on the work you do or your message?
I guess I think the the sentiment that I'd like to leave everyone with today is whatever the thing is that you're struggling with, you will give yourself so much more grace if you stop swimming upstream against your body and your habits and your inclinations. I think we live in a world that oftentimes tells us like if you have issues, you have to change yourself in order to solve those issues. And in case you're waiting for a sign, this is someone giving you permission to do the thing that would actually feel right to you that you feel like you're not supposed to do. That's my advice.
I love it so much. Thank you, Haylin, for your energy and for the work you do and the offerings that you have for the world. I really hope that we can have you on the show again in the future. But this has been a pleasure.
Bring Cleo on too. We'll all chat.
I would love that. We should do a little trio thing. That would be amazing.
A round table.
Thank you, Haylin.
Thank you very much.